The autumn wind carried the scent of fresh turned earth as Frances Harrison knelt before the simple wooden cross, her shoulders shaking with each sob that escaped her trembling lips. The Montana Territory of 1876 had already taken so much from her, and now it had claimed Thomas, her husband of just 2 years, leaving her alone in this unforgiving land with nothing but memories and a small plot of rocky soil to call her own. "I cannot do this without you," Frances whispered, her fingers tracing the roughly carved letters of Thomas's name. Her black mourning dress pooled around her knees, collecting the red dust of Montana City's small cemetery. 6 weeks had passed since the mining accident that crushed the life from Thomas's body, yet the raw wound of his absence felt as fresh as the day they'd laid him in this cold ground. She didn't hear the approaching footsteps, didn't notice the shadow that fell across her husband's grave until a deep voice broke through her grief. "Madam, begging your pardon, but you've been out here since sunrise." The voice was gentle but weathered, like leather worked soft by years of use. Storms coming in from the mountains. Frances looked up through tear-swollen eyes at the tall figure standing respectfully at the edge of the fresh grave. The man removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached hair that had once been the color of honey. His face was tanned and lined from years under the open sky, but his eyes clear blue as a mountain lake held genuine concern. "I don't care about any storm," she replied, her voice hoarse from crying. The stranger shifted his weight, his spurs making a soft jingling sound. "Your husband wouldn't want you catching your death out here, madam." A bitter laugh escaped Frances's lips. "And what would you know of what my husband would want, sir?" The cowboy looked uncomfortable but didn't retreat. "Name's Noah Yates. I rode with the Harrison supply train last spring." "Your husband, he spoke of you often, proudly." He cleared his throat. "Thomas was a good man." Frances stared at the stranger Noah, trying to place him in her memories. There had been many men who'd worked with Thomas, faces that blurred together in her recollection. She'd been too busy establishing their home to pay much attention to Thomas's colleagues. "The storm's going to break any minute," Noah continued, nodding toward the darkening western sky. "Let me help you back to town at least." "I have nothing in town anymore," Frances said flatly. "The mining company took our house when they settled Thomas's accounts. The unfairness of it still burned. The same company whose negligence had killed her husband had then claimed their home as payment for supposed debts." Noah frowned, his weathered face creasing deeper. "That ain't right." "Very little is right in this world, Mr. Yates." A fat raindrop splashed onto Thomas's grave marker, followed quickly by another. The storm was moving faster than either had anticipated. Noah extended a calloused hand toward Frances. "Let me help you start again, Mrs. Harrison. Just with getting out of this weather for now. There's more than one way to honor your husband's memory, and I don't reckon dying of pneumonia is one he'd choose for you." Something in his words, or perhaps just the simple human kindness they represented, broke through Frances's wall of grief. She placed her trembling hand in his and allowed him to help her to her feet. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted, as the rain began to fall in earnest. Noah settled his hat back on his head and guided her toward a dappled gray horse tethered nearby. "The widow Abernathy runs a boarding house at the edge of town. She's a fair sort. I can take you there." Frances hesitated, looking back at Thomas's grave as the rain began to darken the wooden cross. "I cannot just leave him." "You ain't leaving him, Mrs. Harrison," Noah said gently. "You're just getting out of the rain. You can return tomorrow if you wish." The practicality of his words penetrated her grief-fogged mind. With a last look at her husband's final resting place, Frances allowed Noah to help her mount his horse. He swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance as he reached around to take the reins. They rode in silence as the skies opened fully above them, the rain washing away the traces of her tears on her cheeks. The widow Abernathy's boarding house was a modest 2-story structure on the outskirts of Montana City. By the time they arrived, both Frances and Noah were soaked to the skin. Mrs. Abernathy, a plump woman with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner, took one look at Frances's bedraggled appearance and mourning attire and immediately ushered her inside. "Poor child, you're half drowned. Noah Yates, what were you thinking, keeping a grieving widow out in this weather?" She clucked her tongue disapprovingly while directing Frances toward the hearth. "Found her at the cemetery, Mrs. Abernathy. The storm caught us on the way back," Noah explained, removing his hat and standing awkwardly by the door, water pooling beneath his boots. "She needs a room," he added, reaching into his pocket and producing several coins. "I'll cover a week's board." Frances turned sharply. "I cannot accept your charity, Mr. Yates." "It's not charity," Noah replied firmly. "It's what Thomas would want. Call it a debt I owed him if it makes you feel better." Mrs. Abernathy, sensing Frances's pride battling with necessity, intervened smoothly. "You can work it off helping me with the washing and cooking if you've a mind to, Mrs. Harrison. I could use an extra pair of hands around here." The offer of work rather than charity made the difference. Frances nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "Thank you, I would be grateful for the opportunity." "That's settled then," Mrs. Abernathy said briskly. "Now let's get you into some dry clothes before you catch your death. Noah, there's coffee in the kitchen if you're of a mind to wait out the worst of this downpour." Noah nodded his thanks but turned to leave. "I've business to attend to, madam, rain or no, Mrs. Harrison." He hesitated, then offered an awkward half-bow in Frances's direction. "I'll check in on you in a few days, if that's agreeable." Before Frances could formulate a response, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Mrs. Abernathy led Frances upstairs to a small but clean room under the eaves. "That Noah Yates is a good sort, Mrs. Abernathy commented as she helped Frances out of her sodden dress. "Keeps to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings and better mannered than most cowboys who pass through." "I know nothing about him," Frances admitted, accepting the loan of a flannel nightdress and woolen shawl. "Been working the cattle drives between Montana and Wyoming for years, from what I hear. Has a small spread about 15 miles east of town that he's building up, bit by bit." Mrs. Abernathy bustled about, hanging Frances's wet clothing near the small stove in the corner of the room. "Respected by most folks around here, which is saying something in these parts." Frances sat heavily on the edge of the narrow bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. "I should not have accepted his help. I have no means to repay him." Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened. "There's more ways to repay a kindness than with coin, child, and sometimes a body does something not expecting repayment at all." She patted Frances's shoulder. "Rest now. There'll be supper downstairs when you're ready." Left alone, Frances found herself staring at the rain-lashed window, listening to the steady drumming on the roof. For the first time since Thomas's death, she was in a warm, dry place with the prospect of food and work ahead of her. It was more than she'd had this morning, when she'd made her daily pilgrimage to the cemetery with no clear idea of what would come after. "Thomas," she whispered to the empty room, "I don't know what to do without you." No answer came, of course, but as she lay down on the bed, a curious thought drifted through her mind. Thomas would have liked Noah Yates. He had always respected straightforward men who kept their word. The realization brought a fresh wave of grief, but also the faintest glimmer of something she hadn't felt in weeks, a sense that perhaps she might find a way forward after all. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, forcing Frances to delay her return to the cemetery. Instead, she found herself helping Mrs. Abernathy with the boarding house chores, grateful for the physical labor that left her too exhausted to dwell on her grief. There were meals to prepare for the 6 regular boarders, laundry to wash and press, floors to scrub, and endless other tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. It was 3 days before the weather cleared enough for Frances to return to Thomas's grave. To her surprise, someone had placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the freshly turned earth and had reinforced the wooden cross so it stood straight despite the heavy rains. "Mr. Yates came by yesterday morning," the elderly caretaker informed her when she asked. "Said he reckoned the storm might have caused some damage. Fixed up several markers that had been knocked askew, not just your husband's." Frances stared at the modest grave, strangely moved by the cowboy's thoughtfulness. It was a small gesture, yet it spoke of a respect for Thomas that went beyond mere words of condolence. That evening, Noah Yates himself appeared at the boarding house just as dinner was being served. Mrs. Abernathy ushered him in despite his protests that he'd only come to check on Francis. "Nonsense," the widow declared, pushing him toward an empty chair at the long dining table. "No man turns down a hot meal after riding in this mud. Mrs. Harrison, be so kind as to fetch another plate from the kitchen." Frances complied, aware of the curious glances from the other boarders. When she returned with Noah's plate, she found herself seated directly across from him, an arrangement that seemed suspiciously deliberate on Mrs. Abernathy's part. "I visited Thomas today," Frances said quietly as bowls of beef stew were passed around. "Thank you for tending to his grave." Noah looked embarrassed. It wasn't much. Just thought someone ought to make sure the marker stayed put after all that rain. Nevertheless, I appreciate the kindness. Conversation around them flowed easily as the boarders' two shopkeepers, a schoolteacher, and a pair of brothers who worked at the lumber mill discussed the day's events in Montana City. Frances ate silently, suddenly conscious of her plain black dress and loosely pinned hair. She'd made little effort with her appearance since Thomas's death, seeing no point in such vanities when her heart was shattered. "Mrs. Harrison has been a godsend this week," Mrs. Abernathy announced to the table at large. "I've not had biscuits this light since my sister was visiting last Christmas." Frances flushed at the praise. "I merely followed your recipe, Mrs. Abernathy, and executed it perfectly," the older woman insisted. "You have a talent for cooking, my dear." "She does indeed," agreed Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner. "If you ever decide you want steadier employment than helping around here, Mrs. Harrison, I'd be pleased to offer you a position." "My wife's been after me to hire someone to help with the midday meal service we're starting for the miners." Frances blinked in surprise. "That's very kind, Mr. Peterson. It's not charity," he clarified quickly. "Good food brings customers and customers bring profit. Simple business sense." Noah watched the exchange with interest. "You should consider it, Mrs. Harrison. A steady income would help you establish yourself here." "I have been considering returning east," Frances admitted. "My sister lives in Pennsylvania. She has offered me a place in her home." The table fell silent. It was a common enough story in frontier towns' widows returning to the relative civilization of the eastern states rather than facing the hardships of Western life alone. "Is that what you want?" Noah asked, his blue eyes studying her face intently. Frances pushed her stew around her plate, unable to meet his gaze. "I want my husband alive, Mr. Yates. Since that is impossible, I must make practical choices." "Pennsylvania's a long way," Mrs. Abernathy observed neutrally. "Would take considerable funds to make such a journey." It was a delicate reminder of Frances's precarious financial situation. The mining company had left her with barely enough to cover Thomas's burial. The train fare to Pennsylvania might as well have been the moon for all her ability to afford it. "I'm saving," Frances said stiffly. "And my sister has offered to send funds once I can reach Denver." Noah said nothing more on the subject, turning the conversation to more general matters. Yet Frances caught him watching her thoughtfully throughout the remainder of the meal. The following morning, Frances was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when Noah appeared leading his gray horse. "Mrs. Harrison," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I'm heading out to my property today. Won't be back in town for a week or so." Frances nodded politely, wondering why he felt the need to inform her of his plans. "I was thinking," he continued, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, "there's a position that might suit you if you're still looking for work while you save for that trip east." "What sort of position?" Frances asked cautiously. "My place needs a woman's touch," Noah said, then immediately reddened. "That is to say, I'm looking for a housekeeper, someone to cook and keep things in order. The cabin's small but sound, and there's a proper room with a door for privacy. The pay would be fair, and you'd have Sundays to yourself." Frances stared at him, stunned by the unexpected offer. "You want me to come work at your ranch, alone, with you?" Noah's flush deepened. "It's not like that, Mrs. Harrison. I've got two hands working for me, brothers named Louis and Mateo. They bunk in the stable. You'd have the second bedroom in the cabin, with a lock on the door if it makes you feel safer." He twisted his hat in his hands. "It's just that I'm expanding the herd this year, which means more work outside." The cooking alone is becoming more than I can manage alongside everything else. Francis hesitated, torn between outrage at what might be construed as an improper suggestion and the practical acknowledgement that the job likely paid better than anything she could find in town. People would talk, she said finally. People always talk, Noah replied with a shrug. But you'd be employed as my housekeeper, not. He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Your reputation would remain intact, Mrs. Harrison. I give you my word on that. Frances glanced back at the boarding house, where her small room awaited. Mrs. Abernathy had been kind, but the arrangement was temporary at best. The position at the Petersons' store would barely cover her room and board, leaving little to save for her journey east. I would need to be able to visit Thomas's grave, she said slowly. Noah nodded quickly. I come to town for supplies every week or two. You could accompany me then, and if there were ever an urgent need to visit between those times, I'd make arrangements. Frances studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or improper intent. She found only earnest hopefulness and what appeared to be genuine respect. May I have time to consider your offer, Mr. Yates? Of course, he agreed immediately. I'll be leaving tomorrow morning. If you decide you're interested, I'll be at the general store around 8 o'clock. He settled his hat back on his head. No hard feelings either way, Mrs. Harrison. I understand it's an unusual proposal. With that, he tipped his hat and left her to her laundry and her thoughts. That evening, Frances sought Mrs. Abernathy's counsel, explaining Noah's offer and her reservations. Noah Yates is as decent a man as you'll find in these parts, Mrs. Abernathy said thoughtfully. Never known him to mistreat a woman or go back on his word. But to live under his roof, just the two of us. Frances twisted her hands in her lap. It seems improper, Mrs. Abernathy snorted. Frontier life makes its own rules of propriety, my dear. Besides, with the Alvarez brothers there, you won't truly be alone with him. She patted Frances's hand. If you're worried, I could ask my nephew Gilbert to ride out and check on you every now and then. He delivers mail on that route anyway. Frances considered this. The practical advantages of Noah's offer were significant steady employment, a private room, and presumably better wages than she could command in town. Yet something beyond propriety was holding her back, something she was reluctant to examine too closely. I feel as though I would be betraying Thomas, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Abernathy's gaze softened. By taking employment with another man, nonsense child, Thomas would want you to survive to make the best choices for your future. But so soon after his death. 6 weeks is not so very soon in a place where life and death walk hand in hand daily, Mrs. Abernathy said gently, and accepting a position as housekeeper is hardly rushing into another man's arms. Frances flushed at the older woman's bluntness. Besides, Mrs. Abernathy continued pragmatically, if your goal is truly to return east, this position might help you reach it faster. The choice is yours, of course, but don't let false notions of propriety stand in the way of sound judgment. Frances slept poorly that night, her dreams filled with Thomas's face and his voice urging her toward something she couldn't quite understand. By morning, she had made her decision. Noah Yates was tying parcels to his packhorse when Frances approached the general store the next day. He straightened when he saw her, his expression carefully neutral. Good morning, Mrs. Harrison. Good morning, Mr. Yates. Frances took a steadying breath. I have considered your offer of employment. Noah waited, making no attempt to rush her response. I would like to accept with certain conditions, she continued. First, I must have your word that my reputation will be protected. Second, I wish to retain Sundays for myself, including transportation to town for church services when weather permits. And third, I reserve the right to leave the position with 2 weeks' notice if I find it unsuitable or if I secure enough funds to travel east. A smile broke across Noah's weathered face, transforming his features. Those are fair conditions, Mrs. Harrison. I accept them all. He extended his hand. Shall we shake on it? Frances hesitated only briefly before placing her gloved hand in his. His grip was firm but gentle, and the simple human contact, the first she'd experienced since the perfunctory handshakes of condolence after Thomas's funeral, sent an unexpected warmth through her. "When would you like me to start?" she asked, withdrawing her hand perhaps more quickly than politeness dictated. "Today, if you're able," Noah replied. "I've a wagon coming for the larger supplies. There's room for your belongings if you can be ready within the hour." Francis nodded. "I have very little to pack. I'll return to the boarding house and settle my account with Mrs. Abernathy." "Already taken care of," Noah informed her. "Seemed presumptuous to pay before you'd agreed, but I left funds with Mrs. Abernathy to cover your stay plus a bit extra, in case you decided against my offer." Frances bristled slightly at this assumption of financial responsibility, then reminded herself that such arrangements were practical rather than personal. "Thank you," she managed. "I'll gather my things and meet you back here." An hour later, Frances found herself perched on the wagon seat beside Noah, her meager possessions a small trunk containing her clothing, a framed daguerreotype of Thomas, her Bible, and a few personal keepsakes secured in the wagon bed behind them. Mrs. Abernathy had pressed a basket of food for their journey into her hands, along with whispered assurances that Gilbert would indeed check in regularly. The 15-mile journey to Noah's ranch took most of the day, the wagon moving slowly over rutted trails that could hardly be called roads. Frances was grateful for the broad-brimmed bonnet that shielded her face from both the sun and Noah's occasional glances. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but neither was she inclined to break it unnecessarily. It was late afternoon when they crested a small rise and Noah pointed ahead. "There it is, Yates Ranch. Not much to look at yet, but it's coming along." Frances followed his gesture and saw a modest clearing nestled between rolling hills and a stand of pines. A solidly built log cabin stood in the center, smoke curling from its stone chimney. Nearby was a barn and corral where several horses grazed. Beyond, she could see cattle scattered across the hillside, perhaps 30 or 40 head in all. "It's larger than I expected," she admitted. "Been working on it for 5 years now," Noah said, a note of pride in his voice. "Started with just the cabin and 10 head of cattle, hoping to double the herd by next spring if the winter's not too harsh." As they approached, 2 men emerged from the barn, the Alvarez brothers, Frances presumed. Both were shorter than Noah but stocky and strong-looking, with the easy movements of men accustomed to physical labor. They watched the wagon approach with evident curiosity. "Mrs. Harrison, meet Luis and Mateo Alvarez," Noah said as he brought the wagon to a stop. "Best hands a man could ask for." "Boys, this is Mrs. Frances Harrison. She'll be keeping house for us from now on." The brothers removed their hats respectfully. Luis, the elder of the two, offered a shy smile. "Welcome, Señora. It will be good to have a woman's cooking again." "My cooking isn't that bad," Noah protested good-naturedly. Mateo, who appeared to be in his early 20s, grinned. "The biscuits you made last week could have served as horseshoes, patron." Frances found herself smiling despite her nervousness. The easy camaraderie between Noah and his workers spoke well of him as an employer. Noah helped Frances down from the wagon and carried her trunk into the cabin, while the brothers began unloading the supplies. The cabin's interior was simple but surprisingly spacious, with a large main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, while sturdy handmade furniture, a table with 4 chairs, a sideboard, and 2 armchairs filled the rest of the space. "Your room is through there," Noah said, indicating a door to the right. "Mine's opposite. The washroom is behind the kitchen. We bring water in from the pump outside, but there's always a kettle kept warm on the stove." Frances's room was small but clean, containing a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small table with a mirror hung above it. A colorful quilt covered the bed, and curtains framed the single window that looked out toward the mountains. "It's not fancy," Noah said apologetically, setting her trunk at the foot of the bed, "but it's private, and the door has a lock as promised." He pointed to the simple bolt on the inside of the door. "It will suit me very well, Mr. Yates, thank you." Noah nodded, seeming relieved by her approval. "I'll let you get settled. Supper is usually around sundown, but there's no rush today. Take your time." Left alone, Frances sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the change in her circumstances. A month ago, She had been a happily married woman with a home of her own in town. Now she was a widow employed as housekeeper on a remote ranch, 15 miles from her husband's grave. "Thomas," she whispered, removing his daguerreotype from her trunk and placing it on the bedside table. "I hope I'm doing the right thing." His image, captured 2 years earlier when they'd first arrived in Montana territory, stared back at her with the same quiet confidence she remembered so well. It offered no answers, but somehow the familiar sight of his face steadied her. With renewed resolve, Frances unpacked her few belongings, washed the travel dust from her face, and changed into a fresh black dress. When she emerged from her room, she found Noah setting the table while a pot bubbled on the stove. "I hope you don't mind," he said, looking up at her approach. "Thought I'd start the stew since you weren't familiar with the kitchen yet." "That was thoughtful," Frances acknowledged, moving to inspect his handiwork. The stew was simple beef, potatoes, and carrots in a thin broth, but it smelled appetizing enough. "May I add some herbs?" "I noticed rosemary growing near the porch steps." "Help yourself," Noah said, looking pleased. "Kitchen's your domain now." By the time the Alvarez brothers came in for supper, Frances had added rosemary and thyme to the stew, baked a batch of biscuits using supplies from Mrs. Abernathy's basket, and set the table properly with the surprisingly decent tableware she'd found in the sideboard. "Santa Maria," Louis breathed appreciatively as the aroma of fresh biscuits filled the cabin. "This is already an improvement, patron." Mateo nodded enthusiastically, taking his seat at the table with undisguised eagerness. The meal passed pleasantly, with the brothers sharing news of the day's work with Noah while Frances listened quietly. She noticed that Noah, while clearly the employer, treated the Alvarez brothers with respect and genuine interest in their opinions. They, in turn, seemed genuinely loyal to him. As they ate, Frances learned that Louis was 28, married with a wife and 2 children who lived in town due to the lack of suitable accommodations for families at the ranch. Mateo, at 22, was unmarried and had been working for Noah for nearly 3 years. Both had come north from New Mexico territory seeking better opportunities. "Mrs. Harrison is from back east originally," Noah told them. "Pennsylvania, isn't it?" Frances nodded. "Yes, a small town outside of Pittsburgh. I came west with Thomas, my husband, when he took a position with the mining company 2 years ago." "I am sorry for your loss, Senora," Louis said soberly. "It is not easy to be alone in a strange place." "Thank you," Frances replied, touched by his simple understanding. "No, it is not easy. But I am grateful for employment." "We are the grateful ones," Mateo assured her, helping himself to a third biscuit. "These are better than my mother's, and I would never tell her so." The genuine compliment brought a small smile to Frances's lips, the first that had felt natural since Thomas's death. After supper, the brothers returned to their quarters in the barn, leaving Frances to clear the table while Noah settled into one of the armchairs with a ledger book. The domesticity of the scene was simultaneously comforting and painful, reminding her of evenings with Thomas in their small house in town. "There's coffee if you'd like some," Frances offered as she finished washing the dishes. "Or I could make tea." Noah looked up, seemingly surprised by the offer. "Coffee would be welcome, thank you. It's been a long day." Frances poured 2 cups and, after a moment's hesitation, took the second armchair across from him. The fireplace between them cast a warm glow that softened the growing shadows in the cabin. "I want to thank you again for the opportunity, Mr. Yates," she said formally, cradling her coffee cup between her hands. "I realize it's an unusual arrangement." "Noah," he said unexpectedly. "If we're to share a roof, you might as well use my given name." Frances tensed slightly. Such informality seemed premature, a step toward a familiarity she wasn't ready to embrace. "I'm more comfortable with Mr. Yates, if you don't mind." He studied her face in the firelight, then nodded. "As you wish, Mrs. Harrison. I meant no offense." "None taken," she assured him. "I simply prefer to maintain certain boundaries for propriety's sake." "Of course." Noah turned his attention back to his ledger, effectively closing the conversation. Frances finished her coffee in silence, then excused herself to her room. As she prepared for bed, she could hear Noah moving about in the main room, stoking the fire, securing the door for the night, his boot heels making soft thuds against the plank floor. It was strange to be aware of another person's presence after weeks of isolation in her grief. Stranger still that the person was neither her husband nor a female companion, but a man who was essentially a stranger despite their brief acquaintance. As she slipped beneath the quilt, Frances found herself listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of a horse, the creak and settle of the log cabin as the night air cooled. Sleep came eventually, but it was fitful and filled with dreams where Thomas and Noah's faces blurred together in confusing ways that left her restless and uneasy. The next morning, Frances rose before dawn, determined to establish her worth as housekeeper from the outset. She built up the fire in the stove, put coffee on to boil, and began mixing dough for breakfast biscuits. By the time Noah emerged from his room, she had breakfast well underway. "You're up early," he observed, running a hand through his sleep-tousled hair. Frances averted her eyes from this unexpectedly intimate glimpse of her employer, focusing instead on rolling out the biscuit dough. "I wanted to have breakfast ready before you and the Alvarez brothers needed to start your day," she explained. Noah poured himself coffee and leaned against the sideboard, watching her work. "You didn't have to do that. We usually fend for ourselves at breakfast, just coffee and whatever's quick." "That's hardly adequate for men doing physical labor," Frances replied, cutting the dough into rounds. "A proper breakfast will serve you better." A smile tugged at Noah's mouth. "I won't argue with that, thank you." The day established a pattern that would become familiar in the weeks that followed. Frances threw herself into the running of the household with determination bordering on desperation. She cooked, cleaned, mended, and even began putting in a kitchen garden, working from sunrise to well past sunset most days. Noah and the Alvarez brothers treated her with unfailing respect, careful to remove their boots before entering the cabin, offering assistance with heavier tasks, and expressing appreciation for her cooking. Yet Frances maintained a polite distance, retreating to her room in the evenings rather than joining them by the fire, responding to conversation with brief answers that discouraged further discussion. On Sundays, as agreed, Noah drove her to town in the wagon for church services. Frances used these opportunities to visit Thomas's grave as well, spending long hours sitting beside the wooden cross that now stood firm and true thanks to Noah's earlier attention. Noah never rushed her, waiting patiently with the wagon until she was ready to return to the ranch. On the third such Sunday, Frances found a small bundle of wildflowers already placed on Thomas's grave when she arrived. She looked around, puzzled, but saw no sign of anyone nearby. "Mr. Yates brought those this morning before services," the caretaker informed her when she inquired. "Said he thought you might appreciate them being here when you arrived." Frances stared at the simple bouquet golden black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers, tied with a strand of dried grass. The gesture moved her in ways she hadn't expected, bringing tears to her eyes for the first time in days. When she returned to the wagon, Noah was waiting as usual, his hat in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. "Thank you for the flowers," Frances said quietly. Noah looked surprised, then slightly embarrassed. "Seemed like the right thing to do." "It was kind," she acknowledged. Thomas would have appreciated the thought. They rode in silence for several miles before Noah spoke again. "What was he like? Your husband, I mean. I only knew him through work, never really got to know him as a man." Frances stiffened, her instinct to protect her memories of Thomas warring with an unexpected desire to speak of him to someone who had known him, however slightly. "He was steadfast," she said finally. "Not one for grand gestures or flowery words, but you always knew where you stood with Thomas. He believed in working hard and treating others fairly." She stared at the passing landscape. "He loved poetry, which surprised many people. He used to read Wordsworth aloud in the evenings sometimes." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "I can see that. He always struck me as a man with depths most folks missed." "Yes," Frances agreed softly. "That's exactly right." The conversation opened a small crack in the wall Frances had built around herself. Over the next few weeks, she found herself gradually engaging more with Noah and the Alvarez brothers during meals, listening to their discussions, occasionally offering opinions of her own. The crushing weight of grief began to lift slightly, allowing moments of normalcy to slip through. One evening in late October, nearly 2 months after she'd come to work at the ranch, Francis was preparing supper when Noah entered the cabin earlier than usual. He was carrying what appeared to be a small crate. "Mrs. Harrison," he began, setting the crate carefully on the table. "I was in town today for supplies and picked up something I thought you might like." Frances wiped her hands on her apron and approached the table cautiously. Inside the crate were several small plants, herbs and flowers, their roots wrapped in damp burlap. "For your garden," Noah explained. "The shopkeeper's wife said these will winter over well if planted soon and bloom in the spring. I noticed you looking at seed catalogs last Sunday after church." Francis touched a small rose bush reverently. "These must have been expensive to ship in." Noah shrugged. "Not so very much. And a garden should have roses, I think." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched Francis deeply. "Thank you, Mr. Yates. I'll plant them tomorrow." "I could help if you'd like," Noah offered. "I'm no gardener, but I can dig holes where you tell me." Francis smiled despite herself. "I would appreciate that." The next morning found them working side by side in the small plot Francis had established near the kitchen door. Noah dug the holes as directed while Francis carefully placed each plant, explaining her choices for their arrangement. "The rosemary should go near the path where people might brush against it, releasing the scent," she explained. "And the thyme will spread nicely between these stones." Noah listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest in her knowledge. His hands, so capable with horses and cattle, were surprisingly gentle with the delicate plants. "My mother kept a garden," he commented as they worked. "Back in Missouri before we came west, nothing fancy, but she took pride in it. Said a woman could tell a lot about a man by how he treated her garden." "Your mother sounds wise," Francis replied, tamping soil around the small rose bush. "She was," Noah agreed quietly. "Died of fever when I was 15. Father followed 2 years later, hunting accident. That's when I headed west." Francis looked up at him, struck by the matter-of-fact way he mentioned such profound losses. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Noah met her gaze, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "Life takes what it takes, Mrs. Harrison. We go on because there's nothing else to do." The words might have seemed harsh from someone else, but from Noah they carried an understanding of grief that resonated with Francis's own experience. For the first time, she saw him not just as her employer, but as someone who had walked a similar path of loss. "Yes," she agreed softly. "We go on." The air between them seemed to shift, charged with a new awareness that Francis wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging. She busied herself with the remaining plants, deliberately focusing on the task at hand rather than the man beside her. Yet as October gave way to November, Francis found herself increasingly aware of Noah in ways that troubled her. She noticed the easy grace with which he moved, the way sunlight caught in his hair when he removed his hat, the sound of his laughter when Lewis told stories of his children's antics. Worse, she found herself looking forward to their Sunday journeys to town, not just for church and visits to Thomas's grave, but for the uninterrupted time in Noah's company. "It's too soon," she whispered to Thomas's daguerreotype one night, tears streaming down her face. "How can I even think of another man when you've been gone barely 4 months?" The guilt was overwhelming. Yet so was the undeniable awareness that life at the ranch had begun to heal something in her that she'd thought permanently broken. The routine of caring for the household, the satisfaction of seeing her garden take shape despite the approaching winter, the simple pleasure of preparing meals for people who genuinely appreciated her efforts, all of it had created a new framework for her days that no longer centered exclusively around grief. The first snow came in late November, blanketing the ranch in pristine white that transformed the landscape. Francis stood at the cabin door watching as Noah and the Alvarez brothers worked to ensure the cattle had access to feed and water despite the weather. "First big snow is always the hardest on the stock," Noah explained over supper that evening. "They forget from year to year how to paw through to the grass beneath." "Will they be all right?" Francis asked, serving him a second helping of the venison stew she'd prepared. "They'll manage," he assured her. We've laid in good supplies of hay, and the creek doesn't freeze solid until January usually. He accepted the stew with a nod of thanks. This is excellent, Mrs. Harrison. The Alvarez brothers nodded enthusiastic agreement. Better than my mother's, Mateo declared, as he did with almost everything Francis cooked. It had become something of a running joke between them. You're all very kind, Francis replied, settling into her own place at the table. Over the months, she had gradually abandoned her practice of eating separately from the men, finding that mealtime conversation provided a welcome break from the isolation of her position. Not kindness, just truth, Louis assured her. Even my Teresa says your cooking is superior, and she is not quick to praise other women's skills. Francis smiled at this. She had met Louis's wife several times now during their Sunday trips to town and found her to be a warm, practical woman who clearly adored her husband and children. Speaking of town, Noah said, I'm afraid the snow may make this Sunday's trip difficult. The wagon won't manage those drifts and the trail's too treacherous for riding double in these conditions. Francis felt a pang of disappointment but nodded her understanding. Of course. Safety must come first. I'm sorry about church, Noah added, knowing her attendance had become important to her, and visiting Thomas. There will be other Sundays, Francis said, surprised to find that while she was disappointed, she wasn't devastated by the prospect of missing her weekly visit to the cemetery. Later that evening, after the Alvarez brothers had retired to their quarters in the barn, Francis sat by the fire darning one of Noah's socks. He sat across from her, whittling what appeared to be a small animal from a piece of pine. May I ask you something, Mrs. Harrison? Noah said after a comfortable silence, Of course. Are you still planning to return east when you've saved enough? The question caught her off guard. In truth, Francis had thought less and less about Pennsylvania in recent weeks, her focus shifting to the immediate needs of the ranch and its inhabitants. I'm not sure, she admitted. My circumstances have changed considerably since I first considered it. Noah nodded, his attention seemingly focused on his carving. You've become important to this place, he said carefully. To all of us, I mean. Francis's fingers stilled on her darning. That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, just truth, Noah echoed Louis's earlier words with a small smile. The ranch runs better with you here. The men are happier, better fed, and he hesitated. I've grown accustomed to your company. A warm flush crept up Francis's neck at his words. Mr. Yates, Noah, he corrected gently. After all these months, I think you might call me Noah, at least when it's just the two of us. Francis set aside her darning, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. I should prepare for bed, she said, rising abruptly. It's getting late. Noah stood as well, respecting her obvious desire to end the conversation. Of course. Good night, Mrs. Harrison. Good night, Noah, she managed, the name feeling strange and intimate on her tongue. In her room, Francis leaned against the closed door, her heart racing inexplicably. Noah had said nothing truly improper, had made no advances or declarations, yet she felt as though something significant had shifted between them. It's too soon, she whispered again to the darkness, but the words lacked the conviction they'd held even a few weeks earlier. The snow continued intermittently for the next 2 weeks, making travel to town impossible. Francis found herself surprisingly content with the enforced isolation, settling into a rhythm with the 3 men that felt almost like family. In the evenings, after supper was cleared away, they often gathered by the fire, Noah whittling or working on his ledgers, Louis writing letters to his wife, Mateo attempting to teach Francis to play checkers, at which she proved surprisingly adept. You are a strategist, Senora, Mateo complained good-naturedly after his 3rd consecutive defeat. You let me think I am winning until it is too late. Perhaps you're simply too confident, Mateo, Francis teased, comfortable enough now to engage in such banter. Noah watched their interaction with a smile, his blue eyes warm in the firelight. Mrs. Harrison has many hidden talents, it seems. Francis met his gaze across the checkerboard, aware of a tension between them that had nothing to do with the game. I'm full of surprises, Mr. Yates. Noah, he reminded her softly. Noah, she acknowledged, her cheeks warming at the intimacy of using his given name in front of the others. Louis, ever perceptive, exchanged a knowing glance with his brother. "I think perhaps we should turn in early tonight," he suggested, rising from his chair. "The cattle will need extra attention tomorrow if this snow continues." Matteo looked as though he might protest, then caught his brother's meaningful look. "Ah, yes, early. Good night, Senora Patron." After the brothers had departed, Francis began gathering the checkers, suddenly conscious of being alone with Noah in a way that felt different from previous evenings. "You don't have to stop on their account," Noah said. "I'd be happy to play a game with you." Francis hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Do you know the rules?" Noah's smile was warm. "I've been watching you trounce Matteo for a week. I think I've got the general idea." They played in companionable silence for a time, each considering their moves carefully. Noah proved a more challenging opponent than Matteo, his strategy more patient and considered. "You're good at this," Francis observed after he captured 3 of her pieces in a surprise move. "I've always believed in thinking several steps ahead," Noah replied, his eyes on the board. "In games and in life." Francis studied his face in the firelight, seeing beyond the weathered features to the intelligence and quiet strength beneath. "Is that how you built this ranch? Thinking ahead?" Noah nodded. 5 years ago, this was just unclaimed land with good water and grass. I saw what it could be, not what it was." He made another move on the board. "Your turn." Francis considered both the game and his words. "And what do you see it becoming in the future?" Something flickered in Noah's eyes, hope, perhaps, or a more complex emotion she couldn't quite name. "Something permanent, a legacy worth building." He gestured to the cabin around them. "This is just the beginning. I plan to expand come spring, larger barn, proper bunkhouse for the hands, maybe even an addition to the cabin." "Ambitious plans," Francis commented, moving her checker. "A man needs something to work toward," Noah said simply. "Something beyond just surviving day to day." The words resonated with Francis in unexpected ways. Since Thomas's death, she had been focused solely on survival, emotional and practical, with no thought to building anything new. Yet here was Noah, steadily creating something from nothing through sheer determination and foresight. "I admire that," she said softly, "the ability to look forward instead of back." Noah's eyes met hers across the board. "It's not always easy," he admitted. "The past has its hold on all of us. But at some point, we have to decide whether we'll let it define our future as well." The conversation had moved beyond checkers into territory that felt both dangerous and necessary. Francis looked down at her hands, at the wedding ring she still wore despite nearly 5 months of widowhood. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she whispered. Noah reached across the board and gently covered her hand with his. "No one's rushing you, Francis, least of all me." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. She should have withdrawn her hand, maintained the proper distance between them, but she found herself unable or perhaps unwilling to break the connection. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire, "for understanding." Noah squeezed her hand once, then released it, returning his attention to the game. "Your move, I believe." The moment passed, but something fundamental had changed. That night, as Francis prepared for bed, she removed Thomas's daguerreotype from its place of honor beside her bed and held it in her hands, studying the familiar features in the lamplight. "I'm not forgetting you," she promised the image. "I could never forget, but I think perhaps I need to start living again, not just existing." Tears blurred her vision. "Is that all right, Thomas? Would you understand?" No answer came, of course, but as she carefully returned the image to its place, Francis felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for months. Thomas was gone, but she remained. And remaining meant more than mere survival. It meant finding a way to embrace life again, with all its complexities and possibilities. December brought heavier snows and bitter cold, keeping the ranch's inhabitants close to the cabin most days. Noah and the Alvarez brothers ventured out only to tend to the livestock and ensure the essential workings of the ranch continued despite the weather. Francis kept the home fires burning, quite literally, maintaining a steady warmth in the cabin and providing hot meals and coffee for the men when they returned from their outdoor tasks. The forced proximity created a new intimacy among them. With little else to do during the long winter evenings, they talked more, sharing stories, discussing books. Noah, to Francis's surprise, had a small but respectable collection, and speculating about the spring to come. Francis learned that Noah had fought briefly for the Union in the final year of the war, too young to see much action, but old enough to understand the devastation such conflict wrought. Lewis spoke of his childhood in New Mexico Territory, where his father had been a respected craftsman whose woodworking skills were sought after throughout the region. Mateo, the most naturally jovial of the group, entertained them with tales of his youthful misadventures, many involving ill-advised wagers or pretty girls who had caught his eye. In return, Frances shared stories of her life in Pennsylvania, her stern but loving father who had taught school, her mother who had maintained a garden that was the envy of their small town, her sister who had married a shopkeeper and now had 3 children. "And how did you meet Thomas?" Noah asked one evening as they sat around the fire, the wind howling outside like a living thing. Francis smiled at the memory. "My father took in boarders male students who needed lodging while attending the academy where he taught. Thomas came to study engineering. He was 22, I was 18. She stared into the flames, remembering. "He was so serious, always poring over his books. My mother worried he wasn't eating properly, so she assigned me to bring him tea and sandwiches in the evenings." "And romance blossomed over sandwiches," Lewis suggested with a smile. Francis laughed softly. "Not immediately. Thomas was very proper, very focused on his studies, but gradually we began to talk about books at first, then about ideas, dreams." She traced the pattern on her skirt absently. "He wanted to come west to help build something new. I wanted adventure beyond our small town. It seemed a perfect match." "It sounds like it was," Noah said quietly. Francis nodded. "We were happy together. Even when things were difficult, after we arrived here, the mining company's promises proving less substantial than we'd hoped, the challenges of frontier life, we faced it together." She swallowed hard. "I never imagined being without him." A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the persistent howl of the wind. "Life rarely goes as we imagine," Noah said finally, "for better or worse. Sometimes both," Lewis added thoughtfully. "When I left my father's house to seek my fortune, I never imagined ending up in Montana Territory, working cattle instead of wood. Yet here I found Teresa, my children, a good life. With a patron who cannot cook," Mateo added, lightening the mood, "until Mrs. Harrison saved us from starvation." The laughter that followed eased the somber turn of the conversation, allowing them to shift to lighter topics for the remainder of the evening. Christmas approached, bringing with it a brief break in the weather that allowed Noah and Francis to make the journey into Montana City for supplies and church services. Francis visited Thomas's grave as usual, but for the first time, she did not linger long. The wooden cross, now firmly established despite the harsh weather, seemed a settled part of the cemetery landscape rather than the raw wound it had represented months earlier. "I miss you still," she told Thomas softly, brushing snow from the base of the cross. "I always will. But I'm finding my way forward day by day." She placed the small pine bough she'd brought on the grave. "Merry Christmas, my dear. Rest well." Noah was waiting patiently with the sleigh when she returned. They had borrowed it from a neighbor whose property they passed on the way to town, the snow being too deep for the wagon. "Ready?" he asked simply. Francis nodded, accepting his hand to climb into the sleigh. As they traveled back toward the ranch, the winter landscape stretching pristine and beautiful around them, Francis found herself studying Noah's profile, the strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the crinkles at the corners of his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as squinting into sun and wind. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Noah glanced at her, eyebrows raised in question. For everything," Francis replied. "For offering me employment when I had few options, for respecting my grief, for—" She hesitated. "For helping me start again in more ways than you know." Noah's expression softened. You've done the hard part yourself, Francis. I just provided the opportunity. Nevertheless, she insisted, I'm grateful, and I want you to know that I've decided not to return east, at least not permanently. Montana is my home now. The sleigh slowed as Noah turned his full attention to her, surprise and something like hope lighting his blue eyes. That's good news, he said carefully. The ranch wouldn't be the same without you. Frances felt a warmth that had nothing to do with her heavy coat or the fur lap robe covering them both. I've come to feel the same way, she admitted. It's become home in ways I never expected. They traveled the rest of the way in a companionable silence that held new possibilities neither was quite ready to articulate. Christmas at the ranch was a simple but joyful affair. Lewis's wife, Teresa, and their children joined them, bringing homemade tamales and a festive spirit that filled the cabin with laughter. Frances had baked cookies and prepared a modest feast from their winter stores. While Noah surprised everyone with small gifts, he'd apparently been crafting in secret for weeks a carved wooden horse for Lewis's son, a doll for his daughter, a delicate pine needle basket for Teresa. For Frances, he had made a small jewelry box of polished wood, its lid inlaid with a pattern of leaves and flowers. It's beautiful, she breathed, running her fingers over the smooth surface. You have remarkable skill. My father taught me the basics of whittling, Noah explained. I've had plenty of winter evenings to practice over the years. Frances had gifts of her own to distribute knitted scarves for the Alvarez brothers, a rag doll for Lewis's daughter that she'd fashioned from scraps, and for Noah, a journal bound in soft leather that she'd purchased in town and inscribed with his initials. For your ranch plans and accounts, she explained as he turned it over in his hands, something more permanent than loose papers. Noah's smile was warm as he thanked her, his fingers brushing hers as he accepted the gift. The brief contact sent that now familiar warmth through her, a sensation she no longer tried to deny or suppress. The new year arrived with continued cold but increasing light, the days gradually lengthening as January progressed. Frances found herself looking forward to spring with an anticipation that went beyond the practical concerns of gardening and ranch expansion. Something was growing between her and Noah, something neither had yet put into words, but both increasingly acknowledged through small gestures and meaningful glances. One evening in late January, after the Alvarez brothers had retired to their quarters, Noah approached Frances as she sat by the fire with her mending. I've been thinking, he began, settling into the chair opposite her, about the ranch expansion in spring. Frances looked up from her sewing. Yes, have your plans changed? Not changed, Noah clarified, but perhaps expanded. He seemed uncharacteristically nervous. I mentioned adding on to the cabin. Frances nodded, wondering at his hesitancy. For a proper dining room, you said. Yes, that, but also. Noah cleared his throat. I've been considering adding another bedroom, a larger one with its own small sitting area perhaps. Frances's hands stilled on her mending. I see. Are you planning to hire additional help? No, Noah said quickly. That is, not exactly. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Frances had come to recognize as a sign of internal struggle. Frances, I need to speak plainly. Her heart began to beat faster at his use of her given name. Please do. Noah leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes searching her face. These past months, having you here, it's changed everything. Not just the practical matters, the cooking and cleaning and such, but the feeling of the place, of my life. He took a deep breath. I find myself thinking of you as more than my housekeeper, much more. Frances felt a flush spreading across her cheeks, but she didn't look away. Noah, please let me finish, he said gently. I know it may be too soon. I know your heart still holds Thomas as it should. I'm not asking you to forget him or to make any decisions now. He reached across the space between them, offering his hand. I'm just asking if you might consider a future where your place here could be permanent, in a different capacity. Frances looked at his outstretched hand, then back to his face open, honest, hopeful, but prepared for rejection. 6 months ago, such a suggestion would have seemed impossible, even offensive. Now it felt like the natural culmination of a path they'd been walking together, step by careful step, she placed her hand in his. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "Not immediately. You're right that I still need time, but yes, I can see that future, Noah. I want to see it." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then suddenly brilliant. He squeezed her hand gently. "That's all I can ask for, time and hope." "Both are yours," Frances promised, surprised by the certainty she felt. In the weeks that followed, a new sweetness entered their daily interactions. Noah began courting Frances, properly bringing her wildflowers when he found them on his rides, reading aloud to her in the evenings, taking her opinion on ranch decisions that would affect them both. For her part, Frances allowed herself to embrace these gestures without guilt, understanding that loving Noah didn't diminish what she'd shared with Thomas, but rather honored his memory by choosing to live fully again. By early March, when the first hints of spring began to soften the landscape, Frances had moved Thomas's daguerreotype from her bedside table to the small jewelry box Noah had made her. It wasn't forgotten, she still looked at it often, but it no longer needed to be the last thing she saw before sleep, and the first upon waking. The spring thaw brought renewed activity to the ranch. Noah began preparations for the cabin expansion, marking out foundations and ordering lumber from the sawmill in town. The cattle, thin after the harsh winter but healthy enough, were turned out onto fresh pastures, while new calves wobbled alongside their mothers. On a mild Sunday in April, nearly 9 months after Thomas's death, Noah and Frances made their customary journey to town for church services and a visit to the cemetery. The wooden cross that marked Thomas's grave was weathered now but still solid, a testament to Noah's careful craftsmanship. Frances placed a small bunch of early wildflowers at its base, then stood quietly for a moment, lost in memories. Noah waited a respectful distance away, as he always did, giving her privacy for this ritual that had become less painful with time. "I'm ready," she said finally, turning to join him. As they walked back toward the wagon, Noah reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers in a gesture that had become familiar over the winter months. "I've been thinking," he said casually, though Frances could detect an underlying tension in his voice. "A dangerous pastime," she teased gently. Noah's smile was quick but nervous. "Perhaps, especially when I've been thinking about us." Frances squeezed his hand encouragingly. "And what about us have you been contemplating so seriously?" Noah stopped walking, turning to face her. The cemetery was quiet around them, the spring sun casting dappled shadows through the new leaves of the cottonwood trees. "Frances," he began, his voice deepening with emotion, "these past months have been— I never expected to find someone like you. Someone who understands the land, the work, the life I'm trying to build. Someone who makes every day brighter just by being in it." Frances felt her heart quicken as Noah reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "This was my mother's," he said, opening his palm to reveal a simple gold band with a small pearl set into its center. "It's not fancy, but it was given with love, and I'd be honored if you would accept it in the same spirit." Frances stared at the ring, then at Noah's face, earnest, hopeful, and showing just a trace of the fear of rejection that even the bravest men cannot entirely hide when laying their hearts bare. "Are you asking me to marry you, Noah Yates?" she asked softly. "I am," he confirmed. "Not to replace what you had with Thomas, but to build something new together, a life, a family, a legacy." He took her hand again. "I love you, Frances Harrison. I think I have since that first day at the cemetery, though I didn't recognize it then." Frances felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were not tears of grief. "I love you too," she whispered. "And yes, I will marry you." Noah's face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if meant for her hand all along. He drew her into his arms then, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of both passion and profound respect. When they parted, Frances glanced back toward Thomas's grave, visible through the trees. "I hope he would understand," she said quietly, "that this isn't forgetting or betraying." "He loved you," Noah said simply. "He would want you to be happy." He touched her cheek gently. "And I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you deserve to be." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Montana City, with Louis and Teresa Alvarez standing as witnesses. Frances wore a new dress of soft blue rather than the traditional white, acknowledging her past while embracing her future. Noah, clean-shaven for the occasion and dressed in his best suit, watched her walk down the aisle with a look of wonder that brought blushes to her cheeks. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken with clear voices and absolute conviction. Afterward, there was a small celebration at the boarding house, where Mrs. Abernathy proudly served a wedding cake she'd baked for the occasion. "I knew from the first day he brought you here that this would happen," she confided to Frances as they watched Noah chatting with the other guests. "Some things are just meant to be, even if they take a winding path to get there." When they returned to the ranch that evening, their ranch now, truly shared, Noah carried Frances over the threshold of the cabin in the traditional manner. "Welcome home, Mrs. Yates," he said, setting her gently on her feet. Frances looked around the familiar space, seeing it with new eyes, not as her place of employment but as her home, the foundation of the life they would build together. "It feels right," she said, turning to her new husband. "Being here with you." Noah drew her into his arms. "It is right," he assured her. "Every bit of it." Later that night, as they lay together in what was now their shared bedroom, Frances traced the lines of Noah's face in the moonlight that spilled through the window. "What are you thinking?" he asked, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "About journeys," she replied thoughtfully, "and how the most important ones rarely follow the paths we expect." She nestled closer to him. "A year ago, I couldn't have imagined being here, being this happy again." Noah's arms tightened around her. "Life has a way of surprising us," he agreed, "sometimes cruelly, sometimes wonderfully." Frances thought of that day at the cemetery, of her overwhelming grief and the stranger who had offered simple kindness when she needed it most. "I'm grateful for both," she said softly. "The sorrow and the joy, they're woven together in ways I'm only beginning to understand." Noah kissed her gently. "We'll face whatever comes together," he promised, "the good and the difficult." "Together," Frances agreed, returning his kiss with one of her own, deeper and more passionate. Outside, the spring night wrapped around the small cabin like a blessing, while inside, two people who had each known profound loss discovered the healing power of beginning anew, one day, one touch, one shared dream at a time. 1 year later, as spring once again transformed the Montana landscape, Frances stood on the porch of the expanded cabin, watching as Noah rode in from the east pasture. Their ranch had grown over the past year: more cattle, 2 additional hands besides the Alvarez brothers, and a new barn that stood tall against the horizon. Noah dismounted with the easy grace that still made her heart skip, leading his horse to the water trough before climbing the porch steps to greet her. "How are my girls today?" he asked, placing a gentle hand on her rounded belly before kissing her softly. "Restless," Frances replied with a smile. "I think your son is practicing to be a cowboy already with all this kicking." "Son, is it?" Noah grinned, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. "Yesterday you were certain it was a girl," Frances laughed, leaning into his embrace. "Either way, this child is determined to make their presence known." Their baby was due in less than a month, a joyful anticipation that filled their days with planning and their nights with whispered hopes for the future. The nursery part of the cabin expansion Noah had begun the previous spring was ready, painted a soft yellow, and furnished with a cradle Noah had crafted through the winter evenings. "I stopped by the cemetery on my way back from town yesterday," Noah said as they went inside together. "Left fresh flowers for Thomas." Frances smiled gratefully at this gesture that had become one of Noah's ways of honoring both her past and their present. Though she still visited Thomas's grave occasionally, the acute grief had long since transformed into a gentle remembrance that could coexist peacefully with her love for Noah. "Thank you," she said simply. "That means a lot to me." "He's part of what brought us together," Noah replied, his arm around her waist as they moved to the kitchen where Frances had stew simmering for supper. "In a way, we both owe him a debt," Frances nodded, understanding completely. Life's strange circles had brought her from devastating loss to unexpected joy. from tears at a graveside to the threshold of motherhood and a future rich with possibility. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and purple, Frances took Noah's hand and placed it where their child kicked most vigorously. "Feel that?" she asked softly. "That's our future." Noah's expression, full of wonder and love, was answer enough. They had built something remarkable together, not just a successful ranch, but a home and family founded on mutual respect, shared labor, and the kind of love that grows stronger through adversity rather than despite it. As darkness settled over the land they both loved, Frances thought back to that rainy day at the cemetery when a stranger's kindness had offered the first glimmer of hope in her darkest hour. "Let me help you start again," he had said, and though neither could have known it then, those simple words had been the beginning of a journey neither would have chosen, but both now treasured beyond measure. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a reminder of the wild beauty that surrounded their home. Noah pulled Frances closer, his hand still resting protectively over their unborn child, while inside the cabin, lamps glowed with welcoming light against the gathering dusk. "I love you, Frances Yates," Noah whispered against her hair. "And I love you," she replied, her voice sure and steady, her heart full. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." It was a promise neither made lightly, forged as they were by loss and redeemed by the courage to embrace life's second chances. Together, they watched the first stars appear above the Montana hills, their shared silence as eloquent as any words could be a testimony to healing, to hope, and to the endless possibility of beginning anew.